And good morning. Here we are, the Moot Men. I don't know if some of you recall Scott Davis. He's actually a customer of ours, and we did some work for him yesterday. And he had asked to get the link, so he might be joining us at some point, if not this morning, in weeks ahead. So some of you might remember Scott. But anyway, we're in the Gospel of John, of which we are all very aware. And I wanted to I plopped out one slide from last time. Verses 14 and 15, we're looking at this, or 14 and 15 is a wrap up of the mass feeding, the feeding of the 5,000. And this morning we're going to move into a second miracle that's coupled right at the feet of this one, and we'll be looking, of course, a little more detail at that. But this, just to tie it together, what I was trying to express last time is that, and tying the story into the occasion of the setting, which is Passover, that I tried to build a case that the Jewish people were actually brought out of Egypt under Moses' leadership in order to come to a promised land. There is a saving that is going on, and there's a saving from the tyranny of Egypt and a saving towards a promised land. And that's a picture of what the salvation that we are familiar with. We are saved from something in order to be saved towards something. And my case last time was I think that we as human beings, illustrated by Israel's reaction over time, is that we tend to focus in on the saving from and less on the saving towards. Now that's just from me, guys, so take it for what it is. And if that is true, this is my concluding statement last time. As we examine Jesus's response in verse 15, we're trying to figure out why he slipped the party. He got away from the party and refused to accept the crowd's kingship offer. And in my opinion, it would only contribute to this further confusion of his mission by reinforcing the common notion of religious tribalism, which, in my opinion, is the outcome of a focus of being saved from. If all we get is one half of the picture, we become by nature very tribal in our thinking. The ins and the outs come join in. And whereas we're going to be exploring this a little bit in the future, but that's my explanation of what of his reaction. So let's move right into verse 16 through 21. And could somebody read this either on the screen or in your text on your desk or in your lap? Could somebody read this, please?
Now, when the evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the Sea of Capernaum. It had already become dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. The sea began to be stirred up because a strong wind was blowing. Then, when they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. But he said to them, "It is I, do not be afraid." So they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going.
That's really quite a story. Thanks for reading that, Dick. Yeah, it's really quite a story. I've really enjoyed my thoughts and study and meditation on this week. So let's dive in here. Before we begin, I wanted to put this in a broader context with the other gospel accounts. Matthew, Mark, and John couple the feeding of the 5,000 narrative with and followed by this story that we're about to engage in, Jesus walking on the water. So that's pretty rare, for three of the four gospels to put these two miracle stories together, one after the other. In Luke, the feeding, so the feeding of the 5,000 is in all four gospels, but in Luke, moves into the Peter's great confession, who do men say that I am? Thou art the Christ. And then followed by the transfiguration narrative. So, we could dive off into that. We're not going to do that, but that kind of stuff is so interesting to me. How the gospel writers, under the inspiration of the Spirit, formulated these stories and brought them together in a meaningful way, expressing what their intent is. So here in John, we're going to continue to keep in mind the Passover context and the outcome of the first narrative. The reason we're going to keep in mind the Passover context, because as we get deeper towards the end of this chapter, there's going to be the bread of life discourse. And that ties right into Passover. So we're going to keep that in mind. And then we're also going to look at the first narrative, the outcome of the first narrative as we look at this story. So where this all took place, I went on to Google Earth, which is an amazing tool. I don't know if you guys, I could just sit and play around with this for hours. It is so interesting. So this is a current satellite image of the north half of the Sea of Galilee. Sea of Galilee is 7 miles wide by 14 miles long. It sits about 500 feet below sea level. And of course, the Jordan River flows out of the south end south towards this Dead Sea. And it's interesting, it's the only river in the world that runs its entire course under sea level. So that's a little trivia of Jordan. We don't know, see my pen here. Bear with me for a minute. Right here, the actual place, we don't really know where it is. It's kind of unclear, but it's in this general vicinity right in here somewhere, at least according to the language of the text. But we do know, I know in Dick's translation is read a little bit different, but I'm going to assume they're going to the town of Capernaum. Let's just assume that. But it's, this is taking place in this northwestern region. And Capernaum is right here. So we know the destination. And what this yellow line represents is right from Google Earth. I scaled it out. That's actually 3.5 mile line. So that shows you the scale of, some texts read 3 to 4 miles. Some texts read 3.5 miles. So I just took 3.5 miles and I scaled it onto the map. So we have an idea of distance and how far 3.5 miles would be. So what this tells us is that if you're a landlubber or a sailor, to be what appears to be a mile offshore and in rough seas is a terrifying experience. And in a rowboat to boot. We know no motorized, you're under your own power and you're out in a boat. So that is basically what I wanted to depict, is kind of where they were and, the fear factor of this experience. So the setting, let's look at 16 through 19. And I broke verse 19 right in the middle, and you'll see why. When the evening came, the disciples went down to the sea, and after getting into a boat, they started to cross the sea to Capernaum. That's just business as usual for these guys. These guys were sailors. They could do this in their sleep. And so they get in the boat and they start rowing across over to the 3 to 4 mile trip plus to Capernaum. And so it had gotten dark, and Jesus was not with them. Notice the emphasis is in bold. The sea began to be stirred up because of a strong wind. And then and they had rowed about 3 to 4 miles. So here are the key points to the setting. This is like, think of this as the setup to the miracle. It was dark. Jesus was not with them bodily. He was not with them. The sea began to stir because of a high wind. And they had rowed 3 or 4 miles. They were out into the thick of things. So that's the setting. Initial contact is B, and that's the underlined portion on your screen. They, the disciples in the boat, saw Jesus walking on the sea and drawing near to the boat, and they were frightened. They saw and they were frightened. There's the two key ideas. They saw Jesus approaching, walking on the water, and they could not get into the coolness factor of all that because they were actually terrified. They were terrified. And I've realized that in some of the other renditions of this, there's much more detail, but John chose to leave those details out. But then in 20 and 21, I've got the word ego eimi, and that's a Greek term that you guys are familiar with in English, I am. And so he said to them, it is I, that is the I am. He says, I am, do not be afraid. His voice, his audible voice said to the disciples in the boat, it is I, do not be afraid. So they were willing to receive him. Right there is really a key idea. Willing to receive into the boat, and then this cool thing happened, this transport thing that Dick read. Immediately they were going to shore. I've had some thoughts on that, and really some fun stuff here. So Jesus speaks in this. Jesus speaks here, ego eimi, I am. And the disciples receive after hearing his voice, and they reach their destination. They go to where they need to be. So I want to comment on it. This is my take on this, guys. And it's all documented. So nothing hidden here. In regards to transformative experience, that is a big term. But I happen to believe, fellas, that this is what it's to be all about. Remember the early days we'd meet, and I would recite that phrase, God's doing something to you in order to do something through you. I believe that. I haven't said that in quite some time, but I believe that. And I believe that what this whole journey is to be about is not to get smarter, but rather that it's transformative. It's to change our belief, our faith is to bring about change in our lives. Transformation. We are being changed into the image of Christ from glory to glory, Corinthians tells us. And that's only one verse, but we all got to land somewhere, and that's where I've landed. I think this whole journey is about transformative experience. Why? It's just simply because we have opportunity to go through this process now so we can be a blessing to other people during this time. We can be the eyes and the hands and the heart of Christ to those that we come in contact with, and it's done through transformation. So That's a very meaningful phrase to me. And I think that's so therefore that's how I see Jesus working with the disciples, that they're in the process of transformation. And that's and this is, this is a training event, if you will. So in regards to transformative experience, it seems to me that we as humans tend to hear before we see. I'm gonna talk here about seeing and hearing, because that's what's happening in the story. The disciples first saw, and then they heard, and that's where we're going with this. And I think that we, as far as where transformation takes place, I'm just going to build a case here that I think it happens a lot of the times through hearing before seeing. Number one, here's my point one. From our own experience, I start here versus scripture. I'm going to move into scripture, but I'm just going to talk from our own experience first. We know that both vision and hearing, and I'm talking about physical sight and actual auditory sensory input through our ears, and these are wonderful aspects of being alive and being enjoying the world around us. We would not want to be without either of these. However, as I think about this, sight as a physical sensory faculty is linear, meaning it's limited by one's orientation. We can only see what's in front of us or within our area of perception by one's orientation and obstacles detract or not detract, they hinder what we can see. Thus we use the term line of sight. It's in our line of sight. That means nothing hindering our eyesight and within a straight trajectory forward. That is sight. So, whereas auditory input is omnidirectional, excuse me, it's not contingent upon orientation and less limited by obstacle. Now, I'm just taking the physical characteristics here. We're going to move it to a deeper level, but just by way of observation. There can be physical obstacles and we can still hear beyond. We can perceive through our hearing what is going on beyond sight. And that's the idea. So number two, as we observe scripture, now this is moving into scripture here, we oftentimes we see, I've got a typo there, oftentimes we see transformative experience initiated through hearing first. Again, transformative experience through hearing, even though in some cases sight has been established. This is the case right here in our story. They saw Jesus coming and they were afraid. Their first response was fear. It's when they heard his voice that they were able to receive him into the boat. And I'm using reception as the idea of bringing in, embracing him into the boat, allowing him into the boat. Fear, it's assumed, fear disappears. And that is an assumption. Number three, it's common for us as believers to hear other people, other believers, or to testify ourselves of hearing from God. We use this term, hearing from God. Or I felt the Lord speak to me. These are both terms, descriptors of how we describe God's voice, God speaking to us. And this is certainly in line with what we see in Scripture and throughout all of church history. God speaks. And in most cases, and I would also say when God speaks, it's a transformative point. You know, it brings about change. Probably if we were to go around our Zoom meeting and talk about times in your life and in my life where they're relatively few, but where we felt God speak to us, it's something we never forget. And in most cases, these transformative points are initiated through what we describe as hearing. And we talk about this God coming to us in some way. We primarily talk about that as hearing versus seeing. But that's not entirely true, but this is the language generally we use. And when we talk about hearing, the last sentence says, it's generally understood by all parties that it may or may not be an audible voice. It's a spiritual hearing is what we're talking about. An impression, a feeling, a knowing, and we know because we know because we know. At a very deep level. Think of it as I was trying to draw an illustration, I'm thinking of moving your finger over a crystal glassware, and it creates a resonance, a sound that actually permeates. And if that were actually even large enough, if we could scale that up, sound has a way to actually penetrate and become resonance within our being. And so that's how I'm thinking about it as we talk about this in our day-to-day, or as we try to communicate as believers. We're talking about a hearing that may or may not be an audible voice, but yet we all understand what we're talking about because it's a common, not very often, but we can engage in that communication and we can understand what the other person is trying to describe. And the terminology is hearing. So here's my point. This is where I want to go with it. Based on observation, I would go so far as to say that how and what we hear informs how and what we then see. Wow. Guys, you may or may not agree with me, but it sure is interesting to think about that what we're hearing, what we're listening to, fellas, you know, what we engage in with our mind and with our eyes and with our ears informs what we then see. The entire, I just thought of this, the entire advertising industry is based on this idea. What we hear informs what we then see. In this regard, sight takes on an output characteristic. Whoa, with power to shape what we are seeing. So what that has really big ramifications. If this is true, then this is why hearing can be transformative. We hear something new, which allows us to see something new. This is a very rudimentary way to describe transformation. Transformation occurs in a normal day-to-day context. The external world doesn't need to change in order for transformative power to change our being from within. It's a matter of how we are now seeing. And the matter of how we are now seeing, what I am suggesting is how we are now hearing. The disciples first saw and they were afraid. They heard his voice, and that changed everything. That changed everything. In our story, I just said this, the disciples first saw, and that resulted in fear. They then heard, resulting in receiving. And I know I'm making an assumption here. I think fear was dissipated. The outcome is that their journey was advanced and they got to where they needed to be. Very quickly, by the way. So let me just take a quick stab at that, that transport thing. I'm going to talk about it just briefly from an experiential level. That there have been times in my life where I have made major hard decisions, and entering into those very hard and difficult decisions to act when I needed to act in a very hard way that was, I knew, going to take some time. But you know what is interesting? That is where the change took place. The outcome, which seemed to be less severe, the outcome, the end game of that decision was less of a turmoil, was less of time, was less of enduring. It was less severe than I thought it was going to be. So I'm kind of looking at this. Once Jesus was present in the boat, and not to take away that Jesus couldn't just zoom the boat over, but what I'm taking that to mean is from perception, making the decision, receiving Jesus, embracing him at that moment, whenever that moment is, in a very hard situation, and when fear is present and it's dark and is really the important piece. The rest of it is just the outcome, and it moves along much more smoother than we anticipate. So, yeah, for what it's worth. But here's I'm going to illustrate this what I'm talking about. The setting of the story, it's dark. They're setting us up here. There's a strong wind. We all know darkness, guys. At our age, we know darkness. We know what it is to be against the wind. Like the old song, Bob Seger, against the wind. We know that. We know experientially that, and we know fatigue. I'm assuming fatigue, 3 to 4 mile rowing in a boat. Let's just assume they had some level of fatigue. We know these things. They were in a vulnerable state. The disciples were in a vulnerable, weakened state, although they were not aware of this till well into their journey. They were on the Sea of Galilee. They were in their work setting. They were in the realm of familiar. But circumstances in life set up a very severe situation that brought them to their knees. And guys, I think all of us in the journey of transformation, we must be brought to something that is bigger than ourselves, something we can't solve. And only then can transformation, a transformative moment, take place. So where that's pointing to is that after the setting here, this is the setting. And what happens is they saw Jesus. They saw Jesus coming on the water. The text says they saw Jesus coming, and we take it just for face value. and they feared. So that was the, that's what I've been talking about. They saw and they feared. And what I think is, wrong screen. They saw what they felt. They didn't see Jesus. They saw what they felt. And I think that is really worthy of meditation, guys. They then heard, "It is I. Do not fear," the ego ami. They heard this with their ears. And where that led them, pointing towards, they received Jesus into the boat. And I'm assuming, again, fear is dispelled once they receive Jesus. That, guys, that word "receive" is a John, the writer John word. We're going to see this over and over. To as many as received him. It's all about this transformative process is about receiving Jesus over and over and over again. And as a result, arrival. They arrive to where they need to be. Really tightly knit story, a really great story, and a transformative story. So it's 7:30, and what we want to do is go into table. Here's the time to snap. And I know that I have talked the entire time. I wanted to get through this. Thank you for your patience, but now it's going to be all of our turn to talk. And I'd like each of us to think about this idea of seeing and hearing. And I'm just leaving it very loose, very open. As you think about these men in the boat, and what can you relate to in regard to seeing and in regard to hearing? So let's move into. We'll go for about 20 minutes, and we'll be I think I just stopped sharing the screen, didn't I?
Yeah.